All right. Well, I wanted to start by saying thank you to Pam for inviting me to give this talk. And again, I also wanted to say to all of you that I'm really excited to get feedback. I've often asked some of my students who have taken this course with me are here, and I often elicit feedback from them. So any feedback you have from me as I go through the talk is very, very welcome. This is very much a work in progress, and I think will probably always be a work in progress. As teachers, we're always trying to improve on the work we're doing. So I wanted to start with a description of what our classes look like here at UNM. So first of all, in the Spanish classes, the makeup of the people who take our Spanish classes, especially our Spanish majors here at UNM, tend to be native speakers of Spanish. So for example, in the fall of 2015 in my Spanish grammar class, I had 27 students, 24 of whom were native speakers and 3 were second language learners, okay? So that's what we're dealing with here. It's not, when we often think about here in Spanish grammar class, I think traditionally we think about people learning Spanish as a second language, but more and more in the United States we know that that's not always the case, right? And here at UNM it's very much not the case. 3 out of 27 were second language learners. And I'd say the makeup this semester is similar, or actually maybe even fewer second language learners this semester. I don't know. There are a couple of people from my class this semester, but I don't know what you guys would think. Alejandra? What do you guys think about 1 or 2 second language learners in our class this semester out of 28? Maybe, about that. So it's actually very few second language learners. Okay, so what does that mean for how we teach grammar? Well, traditional approaches are very much unsuitable. They really don't work in this context. Why? Traditional approaches tend to rely a lot on textbook grammar. And there are at least 2 problems. I'm just going to talk about 2. There are definitely lots of problems with textbook grammar, but 2 that I want to identify here. One is that textbook grammar, that's kind of hard to see, sorry, but I'll read it to you. Textbook grammar assumes a lot of prior knowledge of grammatical terminology. And when I say textbook grammar, I'm talking about grammar books that are created for advanced grammar courses. I'm not talking about Spanish 101, right? This is a 300-level Spanish class. So you open a Spanish grammar book that's meant for kind of advanced students, and you see a lot of terminology that people generally would learn in Spanish 100, Spanish 200 level classes, right? And my second language learners that come into the class know these terms. Conjugation, right? But the native speakers, and remember we're talking 90% at least of the class being native speakers, generally aren't familiar with these terms. And they come in and they know all the concepts, they know the grammar, but they don't necessarily know the terms. So that's an issue with typical or traditional approach. Native speakers, of course, know how to use the grammar. It's not that they don't know the grammar patterns, right? But they don't necessarily know the terminology. And just to, I know everyone in this audience, so you don't need this example, but I'll give it to you anyway. This is just for people who aren't used to teaching language. Imagine you're in an English grammar class and the teacher says to you, conjugate to be in the present perfect tense. And you're the only native speaker of English in there. And all the second language learners of English, they get to work. Ooh, yeah, I'm conjugating the present perfect tense, to be. And you're like, what? What's the present perfect? Okay, this happened to me when I was teaching English for the first time when I was in my 20s and I moved to Spain. I had my first class and I said, what do you guys want to study? They said, we want to study phrasal verbs. And I went, okay. But, right, we don't know the terms for our own grammatical constructions. You guys do, you're linguists, that's different. But most people don't know the terms for grammatical constructions in their own language, right? So, the problem, we laugh and it is funny, but at the same time, it's actually a pretty serious problem. Why? Well, so you know how to use these things. You know how to say have been, has been, but you don't know the label present perfect. The problem is, how does this scenario make you feel? How do you think it makes you feel? And not you, but like imagine you're a young undergraduate student who speaks you speak your own language, and then you're in a classroom studying your own language, and you don't know how, you feel like you don't know how to conjugate, or you don't know this term. What does it make you feel? What do you think? I know I'm preaching to the choir here, but what do you guys, what's your...
ignorant, horrible.
Yeah, it really makes people feel terrible. It makes people feel insecure. I've had so many people come up to me like, wow, I didn't know how little I knew about my language, right? And so it makes people feel insecure, and then of course linguistic insecurity, does that make you want to speak your language if you feel bad about it? No, then you want to speak your language less, right? And so that can lead to language loss, which is exactly the opposite of what we want to promote at UNM and hopefully around the globe. Another problem is, of course, the textbook grammar. Now, this is a problem for all of us in this room. As linguists, I find it very hard to teach textbook grammar because I teach something and I'm going, but that's not how it works, but that's not how it works, right? But it's really, it's almost like you have to turn off your linguist brain to teach textbook grammar, right? Because in real life, people don't follow textbook grammar necessarily. So you're presenting grammar rules that don't necessarily match what people do and what your actual students do in the classroom. And I used to say, okay, I'll just turn off my linguist brain and present this rule that's in the textbook. But I started thinking, well, wait a minute, I'm a linguist. I know what grammar is, so maybe I should bring that to the table instead of ignoring that, right? Okay, well, here's an example for you. An example is going to ring true for a lot of people in this room. So the textbook rule tells us for the verb haber, there is, in Spanish, in the past tense, you have to use había, even if the noun that you're presenting after is plural, right? So instead of there were 3 chairs, you have to say there was 3 chairs. It's the opposite rule of English, right? So you have to say había 3 sillas instead of había. So imagine you're teaching haber impersonal, haber in general, and the grammar book says this. It says, do not use habían. And everyone in the room is going, wait, I use habían, what's wrong with me? So, you know, habían in this context is very common, but it's non-standard. It doesn't follow the textbook rule. And then those non-standard forms are stigmatized and described as uneducated. And in current modern grammar books, you'll still see, I have an example, not here, but I have an example I show my students of an X through the N in habían. I mean, that's a pretty powerful message to a room full of people who use the word, right? No, don't do that. Don't speak the way you normally speak. So that's pretty upsetting, right? So to summarize the scenario at UNM, we have majority of our speakers enrolled in our Spanish grammar classes are native speakers of Spanish who know their grammar. They know how to speak Spanish, but they don't necessarily know terminology. And their own grammatical patterns may often diverge from textbook grammars. So, we have to, what are different solutions? Damian and I have been talking about different solutions. I think there are many solutions. So what I'm going to present today is just one. It's just one solution, but I think there are lots of different ways this can be handled. How do we teach grammar in a way that legitimizes students' own way of speaking? Habían isn't bad. We know that as linguists. There's no way I'm comfortable teaching a grammar class where people walk away thinking that that's a bad way to talk. I can't do that. It wouldn't sit well with me. And it would be wrong. It's unethical, in fact. I want to teach grammar in a way that helps students appreciate all varieties of Spanish, right? Rural speech. I want them to appreciate northern New Mexican speech. So I want them not to go and talk to people in northern New Mexico and correct people from saying things like vide, which is the archaic form of saying be, yo vi. Even archaic is probably not. It's current, so is it archaic? Anyway, yo vide, I saw, right? I don't want our students going and correcting people when they hear yo vide and saying, no, you're supposed to say yo vi, right? I want them to appreciate all of these different forms. Right? We all want this. Also, one of the things I guess that is clearly very stigmatized among our students is bilingual speech. And every class, every time I start this Spanish 352 class, is something that comes up, right? I don't speak Spanish well because I speak English and my English has influenced my Spanish. So that's another thing that has been very important to me. How do you incorporate the notion of bilingual varieties being legitimate varieties and incorporating that into a grammar class? That's important. And at the same time, I'm a linguist. I really want them to know the concepts and the terms. I want to teach some of that, right? Like, I don't want to teach a grammar class that doesn't give them some sense of well, what's a subject, what's a direct object. I want them to get some basic concepts of grammar, right? Yeah, so those are examples of grammar. Okay, so there's one approach I've been working on for a while now. I'm calling the sociolinguistic approach, and the goals of this approach are to increase appreciation for all varieties of Spanish, to highlight the socio-political contexts that lead to one variety becoming the so-called standard, the textbook grammar, and other varieties not, right? So connecting grammar to society and socio-political issues. And also, at the same time, I still want to teach grammatical terms and concepts, right? So here's what here's the rest of the talk. That's really just my introduction and my big picture questions, but here's what I'm going to do for the rest of the talk. I'm actually just going to describe the curriculum, right? What I've done so far. I'm going to give you a course description, the student learning outcomes, a small snapshot of the syllabus, and then I'm going to go through as quickly as possible an actual lesson plan so you can see what I've done. It's been an enormous amount of work, so I want you to see what has gone into this. And then a bit of a discussion of assessments that I've been using, summary of the benefits of the approach, possible criticisms that I've thought of for myself and how I would respond to them, and then some testimonials from students, although we have students here, so maybe they'll give you their testimonials. If I have time, maybe a little bit about an ongoing research project that I've been doing with Mary Hudgens Henderson to test how well this method is going. And then hopefully feedback from you guys. So again, if you see something that you think isn't working, jot it down for me, let me know, I really would appreciate it. Okay, so here's the course description. Here's how it reads. This is not yet in the course catalog, but it's on my syllabus, but eventually we'll need to get it into the course catalog. So, in this course, we study how Spanish grammar can vary depending on place, social group, and social situation, thus moving beyond so-called correct or textbook grammar. Actually, some of that last part of that sentence was on there from a long time ago, I think. Through the investigations of the variability of grammar, the rest is new. Students will learn grammatical terminology, how to identify categories and constructions in Spanish. We will also examine why some varieties of both Spanish and English are considered prestigious, while others are not, drawing on current and historical socio-political contexts. Finally, we will discuss and question our own language attitudes throughout the course. I think that's really what we've been doing, right? Would you agree? Okay, so here are the SLOs. There are 6 of them. The first one, students will expand their knowledge of grammatical structures. So this is sort of the more traditional part, right? Grammatical structures of Spanish, and will apply this knowledge to analyses of constructions and discourse. I think most grammar courses do this nowadays, so that's not that different from other courses. Students will increase their knowledge of linguistic terminology and apply this knowledge as they describe constructions and discourse. That's also not that different from other courses, although I'd venture to say that in this approach it's actually getting done better, but we can talk about that in a minute. Students will distinguish between prescriptive and descriptive approaches to grammar. Students will recognize and explain variation in Spanish. Students will recognize the underlying socio-political factors that impact people's language attitudes and perhaps change their own belief system and that of others regarding the way people talk. This I thought was going to be the hardest thing, but I'm blown away every semester it seems to be working. Students will develop the tools and habits of mind to continue lifelong inquiry and learning about linguistic variation and language attitudes. Okay. Oh, sorry, that's the same thing. Okay, so here's a snapshot of part of the syllabus, just the beginning. So far I've been, and actually, so I want to thank Sarah Schulman and Viviane Lefariat, who's not here anymore, she's now at Harvard, for helping me think about the structure, especially for the first 2 weeks. So we spend the first 2 weeks similar to how a lot of us teach intro to linguistics courses, all right? I've realized this has been, at first I started with only a week, and then we talked about it and realized it needed more time, more than a week. We need 2 weeks to really get people thinking about language attitudes. So I start off with what is grammar, and you know, very typical Ling 101 type thing, right? What is grammar, what's prescriptive grammar, what's descriptive grammar? Because everyone comes to the class thinking grammar is prescriptive grammar, right? So I teach it at that point, but then I have to keep teaching it throughout the semester. It's actually a hard thing to get people to stop thinking that grammar is prescriptive grammar, right? And then the second week I really get into language attitudes and linguicism. Okay, then by week 3 I start with specific topics. So far right now, the way I have it set up is the first topic is a lesson on, the lesson's called Como tú estás? How you are, right? So, does anyone, how would you guys say this sentence? This question, how are you? ¿Cómo estás or cómo está? And if you express tú, ¿cómo estás tú? Right? So this is a Caribbean word order that's common in the Caribbean. So subject, verb, word order in WH questions in the Caribbean. So we start with that. That's how I introduce the notion of a subject, of a verb, of a pronoun, and word order, and then terms like interrogative, pronoun, subject, verb, and things like that. And then we get into signatization. Okay? And that's the lesson plan I'm about to show you. The next thing is, then after that I go into voceo, so I'm still on subjects, right? And we talk about voceo, we talk about verb conjugation, they start learning about grammatical persons and then variation. Voceo is a really, really great topic. I'm not going to get to talk about it here today, but it's a great topic for this type of course because it's so frequent and so common and represented in so many countries, and it's absent from most grammar books. So it's a really nice thing to have early in the semester for the students to see, look at all this usage that is not reflected in grammar textbooks. So then I do voceo, and then object drop, thanks to Josefina, who's given me a lot of help with that, where we focus on Paraguay and Basque Country, where you have sentences like, yes, I saw. Did you see that boy? Yeah, well, maybe not an anime, right? Did you see that dog? Yes, I saw, right? And so I show these clips that Josefina has shared with me. And we talk about bilingual varieties and how they are stigmatized, right? Why are these forms accepted? And this structure tends to be found in situations of language context. So we talk about that. And in that lesson, look, they learn direct objects, direct object pronouns, and then you have the language attitude. So every class has variation, grammar point, and then language attitudes. So that's that structure for every lesson. And then leísmo, so regional variation, leísmo, where is it found, what is it? And notice the grammar points there, you get into direct versus indirect objects, which is one of the hardest things I've ever had to teach. I mean, I find this to be the hardest topic to teach, and this semester I feel like I finally got it. I hope, I think. I'm seeing with their final presentations that they got it, which is really exciting to me, but I find that that's a hard one to teach. And then again, language attitudes. Leísmo is actually quite a certain type of leísmo. For those who don't know what it is, it's just when you use the indirect object pronoun instead of the direct object pronoun. Right? Le instead of lo. It's actually accepted, and it's stated by the Academy of the Spanish Language that this is an accepted variation. And it's stated that it's accepted because people of a certain class use it. So it's another really excellent, beautiful example of showing how things become accepted as norm, as standard, and legitimate, become accepted as legitimate varieties or legitimate usages. Okay, so let's go into the sample lesson plan. On your computer in front of you, everyone should have one computer in front of them. There is a handout on the desktop. You're going to actually look at the lesson. I'm going to go through it. It's much more interesting this way than just listening to me talk, right? You'll want to get it. You'll want to be in front of the computer. Or share with. Okay. Okay, so this is from a textbook that I'm in the process of writing, creating, and I gotta tell you, for anyone who's interested in writing textbooks, this has been so much more challenging than I expected it to be. It's one thing to run it in class, like I can always, if I make a mistake, I can go and fix it. It's another thing to put it out there as materials that other people can use without you guiding them. So it's been extraordinary, but my co-author has a lot of experience and that's been helpful. We're not done, so any feedback is welcome. Okay, so here's this lesson is the Como tú estás lesson, and the objectives are to compare dialects. So we're going to compare subject, verb, order in WH questions, in QU questions, I'll call them. And I want them to recognize certain terminology, basic concepts, so I'm teaching them what a subject is, what a verb is, what a pronoun is, and then we talk about stigmatization. I'm going to run through this pretty quickly so that we don't spend too much time, because this takes an entire class period, as you might imagine, right? And we don't have that much time. Okay, so the first step in this lesson plan is for the students to read this dialogue that comes from the Otegi Centella corpus of Spanish in New York. Now, notice, I want to point out that their first step in the entire lesson is reading usage. That's not necessarily that different from other modern courses in grammar, but it's important to me that you notice that it's coming from actual usage, right? That's the first step. I don't start with what is the subject, right? Start with usage. Okay, so they read this dialogue, de donde tú vienes, you can see it there on your handout. And then they're asked to fill out the column A, you see in the table 2.1? They're asked to copy and paste every single question from the dialogue into column A. That's the first step, okay? And remember that everyone in this class can understand this dialogue. So this is easy for them. This is super easy. Second step then, if you scroll down to page 2 of your handout, I'm on the Word doc now. It should be on your desktop. Does everyone see it? Oh God, she'll help you, she'll help you. Gotta help him out. He's looking at the screen. No, it's on your...
I'm looking at
And actually, when I thought about doing it this way, this is how we've been doing it in class. So I have a PowerPoint that ends up with the answers on it, and I'm including that in the textbook, right? And the students are doing this kind of work on their own, although I think some of it should be homework. It would be good to assign some of it as homework and some in class. Okay, anyway, you're in step 2, and it says, fíjate en las preguntas números 1 a 5, so look at the questions in column A, 1 to 5, and number 7. Is this how you would say them? Now notice in column A, I put in, here's the table. I always have a model, for those of you interested in pedagogy. Every single activity starts with a model, because not everyone reads instructions these days, as you know. So here's the model of the first question, and then they've gone down and they've left this in blank, right? And they've gone down and they've filled this in with 8 questions that are in this dialogue, right? And then the next step, here are the 8 questions. Okay, they've done this. You've all done this already. And then the next step is, how would you say these? Are there any that you would say differently? So let's imagine, Yesenia, you're going to help me out, okay? So you're doing this, you're in the class, and then what do you think you would answer for this? And there's also in the instructions says you have to use the word tú. Why? Because this semester I'm seeing a lot of people were just omitting tú, which is natural, of course, but you have to use the word tú. So how would you say this?
You have to use the word.
Yeah, put it in there, yeah. Or do a, ¿de dónde tú vienes? ¿De dónde tú vienes?
¿De dónde vienes tú?
There you go. And they're all going to do that. They're all going to, if you say you have to put in tú, you're going to get all of the verb, subject, word order from them. Okay, so now...
What if someone said tú, de dónde vienes?
They have said that. That's fine, because you're still not right before the verb, right? I mean, And by that's fine, I mean that's fine for my objectives for this lesson. It's fine, all of it is fine, obviously, in terms of usage. Okay, so that's the second one, and then, so you ask them, oh, no, I'm sorry, I actually skipped over a step. The second step is how do they sound to you? Do they sound like you would say them, or do they sound different, right? And so here in New Mexico, everyone says they sound different than I would say them. But if this were in New York, you get lots of variation there. Some people, if you have a neat classroom with someone going, yeah, that's how I would say it, others go, no, that's not how I would say it. That's fine too. Okay, and then, here we go. The third step here is how else can you form these questions? And now this is where I was with Yesenia, right? So how else would you form these questions? You have to go in and say, do it how you would say it. ¿De dónde vienes tú? ¿Cómo te llevabas tú con tus hermanos? ¿Cómo dirías tú? Etc. So then they're going to see this clear distinction between the pre-verbal subjects in column A and the post-verbal subjects in column B. Okay? I've done those for you. The next step in this lesson is they have to answer this question. They have to try to think about this question. Okay, so what's the difference between A and B? Right? They're looking at it, they're looking at their sheets, and what's the difference? And this is just a noticing exercise, and it leads them to some generalization. Generally, they'll say something like, oh, the tú comes before vienes, or something like that. They're not even necessarily going to say the tú comes before the verb. They might not even have that terminology. Some will, some won't. But they notice the pattern, so they've seen the pattern, but they still lack the terminology to actually describe the variation they've just reviewed. So then I start with the terminology. Then I get into, so every chapter is usage, structure. So here's the structure, which is the more traditional approaches to grammar, and then language attitude. So here's the structure part, and then this part introduces what's a personal pronoun, subject pronoun, how we call it in English, grammatical subjects, start noticing verb endings. This is actually a very exciting part, when you start really highlighting, look what the verb ending is doing, right? For a second language learner, they get that in Spanish 100, but if this is your native language, it's a little bit like, hey Naomi, what's a phrasal verb? Oh wow, we do that in English? I use them all the time, right? So for the learners who have been speaking Spanish all their lives, they're conjugating all their verbs, but they're just starting to really notice the patterns and in both their metalinguistic skills, right? Okay, so here's an example from the estructura. There are 10 sentences, and then they start to dissect the verb, right? And we start teaching them terms like third person plural. I heard my students using it today. They really got into first person singular, second person singular, third person plural. So those kind of terms, they start getting comfortable with those, and separating the verb endings, and then connecting the verb ending with the subjects, and in this case with the subject pronouns, okay? Then in step 2, so are you guys scrolling down and following on your sheet? In step 2, let's see, I'm going to scroll down so you can see how you're looking at it. So that was cuadro 2.3, and they fill out from those 10 sentences, they take the verbs out. This seems super easy to you guys, right? But sometimes you'll have students who they might not necessarily know how to identify the verb. So this really gives you, out of usage, a chance to cover very basic concepts of grammar at the relatively early part of the semester. Okay. And then, paso dos, now we go back to that difference. Right? It says, ahora que sabes identificar los sujetos y los pronombres, escribe una oración que explica la diferencia entre las maneras A y B. Just check. Yeah. Oh yeah, here. Escribe una oración que explica la diferencia entre las maneras A y B de formular las preguntas siguientes. So now they have to describe the difference that they noticed in the first usage part, but now they actually have the tools to describe it. So now they can say, oh, the subject pronoun in column A is before the verb, and in column B is after the verb. Seems like a lot of steps to get there, but I've tried it without all those steps and it didn't work. They really need this kind of slow scaffolding, and then when they get there, it's very easy to them because they've seen the pattern, right? Okay, so that's a very quick run through of usage and then a grammar structure. And notice, and I do stop, I mean, some of the students could confirm this, I stop a lot to remind them, hey, have you noticed how much terminology you're using right now? Now you know what a pronoun is. Now you know, oh, okay, ¿saben qué es un pronombre? ¿Saben qué es un sujeto? ¿Saben qué es un verbo? Right? And now you know about subject-verb agreement and things like that. And so they're realizing through the course that, oh, I am learning all of these grammatical terms. I do that because I want to, sometimes in our conversations it can feel like we're not studying grammar, which is good, but I want them to see that they are also studying grammar. Okay, then we get into the socio-political factors and the linguistic attitudes, right? So we're in part 3 now. ¿Cuáles son las actitudes? What are the attitudes about this grammatical structure and varieties? And what are the attitudes towards the varieties in which you find the subject, verb, word order, and WH questions? So basically, what are the attitudes towards saying, ¿cómo tú estás? Or ¿cómo yo aprendí el español? ¿Cómo aprendiste el inglés? ¿Cómo yo aprendí el inglés? O ¿de dónde vienes? ¿De dónde tú vienes? What are the, right? People start laughing a little when they hear those structures because they're quite unique and very identifiable as Caribbean. Okay, so how do I do this? Again, a lot of steps to get there. The first thing we do, and here I'm on 3 actitudes. The first thing we do is we go, I want to highlight that this usage they've just seen, this natural usage, is not accepted in standard grammars, meaning in textbooks. Like textbooks tell you you have to invert the subject and the verb in WH questions in Spanish. They tell you it's obligatory, in fact, right? So the first step is, what do the textbooks say about forming questions in Spanish? And they look for web pages. And then I give them this example that I found a lot. Preparing for this class is fun because I get to do a lot of Google searches, actually. So I found this example from LearnSpanishBetter.com, where they say, when forming any kind of question in Spanish, remember that the verb always becomes before the subject. So now they're seeing this rule that they might have found in a grammar book, but they're seeing it after they've just figured out that that's not always true, and they actually understand the description. Now they can process what this means, right? Okay, so then, so this illustrates what textbook grammar has to say about verb, subject, word order in WH questions, and students begin to see that textbook grammar doesn't always match usage, which is, we talked about where it's from, so we haven't talked about the social factors yet. So then we have this exercise that I think I'll let you do just because it's fun. So why don't you guys do step 2. This is the exercise to figure out where these people are from. So here you have bands. So artista is the band, like gente de zona is the name of the band, and you have to fill in where that band is from. And then we give you a name of a song, like so you have que tú quieres, and then the words of the song. Que tú quieres, mamita, que tú quieres estar conmigo y que tu novio no se entere. That's always fun, right? So why don't you guys do that, just because it'll be fun for you, I think. Do it for 2 of them. Gente de zona. How would you do it? You just do a Google search. I have to say, a lot of this class, what I've been really into, and I'm seeing is actually a real benefit, is teaching how to look for information about grammar. That's the lifelong learning piece, right? Gente de zona. Where are they from? Cuba. Very good. You got the answer very fast. Y el siguiente, ¿cuál es? A ver. So that one's Cuba. The siguiente, Nicky Jam. ¿De dónde viene Nicky Jam? We didn't do this exercise, you guys, this year. This came later as we were fixing up this lesson. ¿De dónde? Nicky Jam de Boston y sus padres, ¿cuáles son los países? ¿De dónde vienen los papás? What are the cultures? Puerto Rico and Dominican Republic. So Nicky Jam is someone from the U.S., from Boston. One parent is Puerto Rican, one parent is Dominican. Okay, so that's right. And then the next one is Pitbull. Miami. Padres cubanos. And then los Van Van. Cubanos. And if we had time, I'd play you the music because they're so good. So, all right. So this exercise links this como tú estás word order with a location, the Caribbean. Okay? See how it's set up there? Right? Now we're into socio factors. Next step, attitudes towards Spanish spoken in the Caribbean. Now, everyone who speaks Spanish in here knows that this is pretty loaded, actually, a pretty intense topic. So, what's the attitude that people have towards Spanish in the Caribbean? So here's what I do. This is actually takes a lot of time for me. I go through and I do Google searches using kind of not very nice terms in my searches to try to find opinions that represent not nice judgments. That's how I do it. Right, I'll look up like el español del Caribe es lo que hablan muy mal, hablan feo, hablan lo que sea, right? And I'll put those things in quotes, and I'll come up with people espousing those kind of negative judgments against people. And I have to tell you, when I first started doing this, I was very nervous about bringing these opinions to class. I was scared. So let's read them. Let's see what they have to say. I didn't put them, but they're on. Okay, so the first one says, ¿Quiénes hablan el peor español en Latinoamérica? This means who speaks the worst Spanish in Latin America? And the person's opinion is the countries with marked, noticeable African influence, like Cuba, Panama, Puerto Rico, Dominican Republic, speak badly. That's what this person wrote. I mean, it's pretty in your face, right? It's pretty in your face, okay? And then they have another.
No shame in writing that.
Right, but this is so huge to bring this into the class, and it's scary. But so far, it has worked very well because I have not to date had someone say, "Yes, I agree with that." That is something, I mean, we can talk about that, like how would you deal with it if someone came in and be like, yeah, they're worse. It has not happened. I feel like maybe the next generation, and half the people in this room can speak to this, I think. At least here I found that people are very open-minded and very caring about social justice. So it's actually been a really wonderful arena to bring up these kinds of issues. And they're surprised to learn how much linguistic prejudice there is. They're not surprised in the sense that, like, when you say it, they're like, oh yeah, that's true. Of course it's true. But they haven't necessarily thought about it before. And so, and it's important to every single person in the class, and all of us, right? Okay. So then we actually have a conversation. Do the people have a favorable opinion about Caribbean Spanish? Negative? Why? Right? And then we talk about why. Now comes a time to try to make the explicit connection between linguicism and racism and classism. Right? And that is, a huge part of this. So in step 4, you can see on your handout. What I did here is I took an interview from an article written by a linguist named Gabriela Faraz, she's a linguist sociolinguist who studies Spanish spoken in Cuba and in Miami. And here she's reporting on an interview she did in Miami. And so we set it up before the interview. We wrote, here where it starts to say, esta señora y otros entrevistados. So that says, this woman and other interviewees comment that the Spanish that's spoken in Cuba in Cuba, not in Miami, but in Cuba, got worse after the Cuban Revolution in 1959. And then we asked the students to underline the parts that maybe signal or show an explanation for those negative attitudes that this woman, Manuela, has for the Spanish spoken in Cuba after the revolution. Now here's here's how the interview goes. You all have this in front of you, right? You can see it? Okay, Gabriela, the linguist, you guys know her, I think, Gabriela. Some of you know Gabriela Faras, no? Lovely woman. Anyway, she says, you say in Cuba they speak very black-like, anegrado. How is that? Yeah, black-like in the way of their expressions. You know, like lazy. It's heavy stuff, right? This is coming straight out of a linguistics article. But not in the pronunciation, says Gabriela. And then Manuela says, yes, everything. The pronunciation, the tone of their voice. What would that come from? What roots does it have? The roots are African, because in Cuba these days, or when I left, there was a tendency towards African, right? And then we say, so what are the negative attitudes? Where are they coming from, the negative attitudes that this woman has towards the variety of Spanish spoken in Cuba? I think it's pretty obvious, right? It's kind of in your face. And then I have, you know, all right, we want to have another example from another country, but we haven't done that yet. So if you have ideas, please send it to me. Okay, so then we talk about that. And then at the end of the lesson, I go back also to grammar and I say, you know, so now explain in your own words, why do you think that subject verb word order in interrogative questions is not included in grammar books? So why is this, you should stigmatize or something like that, depending on the lesson. And that wraps up the lesson. And I also remind again, okay, now you know what a subject is, now you know what a verb is, now you, right? So it's kind of doing a lot of things in one lesson. Okay, so I want to give you a quick snapshot of other topics I covered. I gave you a snapshot of, okay, the subject, so subject verb word order, then museo, then, right? I also do había, navía, which I talked about at the beginning of this class. Aiga, person morphology, so the use of comistes. And this semester, everyone was like, what, you don't say comistes? Right, so that was fun. Vive, hablábamos, we talked about today. Me levanté, me he levantado. So present perfect, simple past, different forms of the past tense subjunctive. We talk about analogical leveling, yo he ido, and we use that term, analogical leveling and regularization. They start seeing these are regular processes in language change, so bringing in things from language change into the class, which is fun, they like it. I change from subjunctive to the indicative. There's a lot of indicative used instead of subjunctive, and people judge that. I also bring up how that's happening in a lot of countries in Latin America. Increase in the progressive, in progressive forms in the US. A personal, that's a nice way to talk about prepositions. So everything I did here, we only picked stigmatized features, but it took a lot, years of planning of trying to figure out how to cover different categories of grammar, right? So nouns, articles, you know, pronouns, right? So we have the noun phrase, and then the verb phrase, and verb conjugations, and different tenses, and then prepositions. Dequeísmo came up, but we actually want to have it as a subsection in our book, but it came up naturally in the final project, so that was kind of exciting. So that's the, on the desktop there, what you should find is a sample lesson plan. I'll tell you about it a little later, but, okay. So another important, very important part of this course has been thinking about the assessments. So I do have them reviewing the grammatical structures in online quizzes. So there is an assessment that's testing their knowledge of the actual terms and identify what's a subject in this sentence, for example, that kind of thing. And then the rest is kind of a little bit more testing different parts of the different SLOs, right? So Molly and Sarah, who are here, thanks to Molly and Sarah, they created 4 homework assignments for a project that they're doing. And it actually has been working out really nice. It's a really nice piece that has been integrated really well into the course design. And these are homework assignments where they're really meant to be a place for students to reflect on what we're learning and then connect the material to their own life experiences. And that's how they thought of it, and that's how they designed it. So they'll ask questions like, have you ever experienced or seen someone experience being made fun of for how they talk? Right, you know, things like that. So they ask probing questions to try to get them to reflect on prejudice, basically. And then the final project. This is huge. It actually goes in several steps throughout the semester, so it's not huge for them. It doesn't come all the way at the end. The first up, it's very typical. I think we do this in a lot of our classes, right? And I think a lot of my students use interviews they've been doing for other classes, like phonetics. So they do an interview, and then they transcribe relevant parts of the interview. They don't have to transcribe it all, and they don't have to transcribe it phonetically. And then they hand in a list of examples that fit with the structures we've been studying. So, and I list them, like look for subject, verb, word order. Look for direct, is there any direct object drop? That's really hard, but it gets them, it's a way to revisit the topics we've been studying, right? And I get to see, oh, okay, I need to explain direct object again, for example, right? And then they hand in a final paper where they again bring up all these structures, but then they write about them. Our interviewee followed prescriptive rules or didn't, and look how, this is why. And they talk about the socio-demographic information that connects the usage to how the person speaks to why they speak the way they do. And then they hand in a PowerPoint presentation to me and give them feedback on their PowerPoint presentation or Prezi. And then they give an oral presentation at the end. So that's a lot, that's a big part of their grade. And then they also have to hand in a final reflection essay on the last day of class where they actually go through each of those 6 SLOs that we presented at the beginning talk and think about what they've learned. So to summarize, we have a class coming in at 2, but I had until 2. So I think that this makes the study of grammar meaningful and important, and it ties grammar to social issues. At the same time, it helps combat linguicism. Just today, there was one student saying, not only do I think we need to think about the words we use, but also spread that, right? We were talking about hablar mucho, speak broken Spanish, because someone brought up that term, and we were all saying, we need not only to not use that term, but now to start telling other people that there's no such thing. I was very proud of them. I almost cried. I almost cry in this class, like almost every semester, ask my students. And at the same time, I think the coverage of grammatical structures is deeper. I cover many fewer structures, to be sure, but their knowledge, I'm seeing them give these talks this semester, and with ease, they're using terms like direct object. And I have never seen that before. I mean, it's fewer structures, but it's much deeper, and I think they're really holding on to the information better. So it's a shorter list of terms. I think that there are some criticisms, like too few structures, someone could say that. Like, I didn't discuss all the uses of say, but I think covering a lot of structures just doesn't work. I don't think it works. I think we know by now it doesn't work, and most people don't remember all those terms. You guys, yeah, because you guys are linguists who love, that's different. Also, I'm really stressing becoming lifelong learners. So I'm really into wordreference.com. It's so simple, but if you don't know how to look for grammar information, even if you look it up online, you're not going to know what's relevant in that web page. So learning how to use simple web pages is, I think, extremely valuable because they can take that with them. And so the topics I don't cover, I think they can get information to themselves. Is it too simple? I mean, it is true. The second language learners come in and some of these things they already know. But they're not the majority. But I shouldn't say it's too simple and then think about the second language learners right away. But in terms of the terminology, the terminology in particular can seem a little simple for people who have been taking classes in Spanish for a couple of years. But the second language learners tend to know some of the prescriptive rules, but very much on the variation. So I've gotten excellent feedback from my second language learners. Some people might say it's not prescriptive enough. Like if you take this show on the road outside of UNM, you'll be like, no, you need prescriptive grammar, you need it. That's a debate. I actually think they're learning more prescriptive rules this way, but they're doing it in a way that doesn't privilege the rule. So they're actually, I am highlighting prescriptive rules, but I'm not highlighting in a way that says they're better. But I'm drawing attention to them at the same time, which means they're learning that, right? And then I had testimonials, but I think even some, I don't have time for that. But thank you so much for, this was really nice. Please let me know all of your feedback and